I am Justin Ryburn. I'm the Vice President of Solutions Engineering here at Kentik. Just a quick background on myself. I am a recovering network practitioner myself, so I spend a lot of time, a little bit in enterprise, mostly in service provider, building and running networks before I joined the vendor side, and been with Kentik about 6 years at this point. So a quick background on Kentik and kind of our mission. We like to say we like to make life awesome for the people building and running the connected world. And what does that really mean? Well, about half of our customers are service providers, large carriers, household names you would recognize. And then the other half of our customers are enterprise. One thing we believe is that while there may be different use cases between enterprise and service providers, there may be different ways the networks are built. There may be different reasons, different problems that we're trying to solve in building, running, and operating those networks. They're really not that much different, right? And so our platform is sold equally to both teams, both service provider and enterprise teams. Today's talk, we're going to focus mostly on the enterprise because that's what we think is interesting for everybody to hear about today. But just know that service provider is also a big part of our business as well. The other kind of pillar of our mission is building one comprehensive observability platform for all of the enterprise infrastructure. And that's really going to be sort of the theme that you're going to hear from us today is we're not a point solution that just looks at maybe the data center or just looks at the SD-WAN or just looks at a particular public cloud provider. Our mission is to be able to provide a platform that can look across all the various different networks that network engineers in the modern enterprise are tasked with looking after.
I just got to say thank you for not saying single pane of glass.
I'm biting my tongue. I'm really trying to, but yeah, we'll table that one. You'll hear a little bit more about this term network observability, and I know a lot of people may snarkily think that this is just a architecture term or a term that has no meaning, similar to SDN a number of years ago. And, that's fine. I think, what it really matters is what do we mean by the words network observability? When we say that, what is it we're trying to say? And, we'll talk a little more about that as we go throughout the day. But what we really mean is we want to build a solution. We want to be able to, as the words mean, when you use the words in their own definition, observe the network, right? To be able to see what's going on with the network, to get proactively notified when there's a problem, to be able to answer the type of questions you see presented here on this slide, right? Why are my users complaining about the internet being slow at one of my locations? What did this particular IP address talk to that's probably belongs to an application that my application team is looking after? Is my network under attack? Are we getting an active exfiltration attack? Are we under a DDoS attack? There's a lot of different questions, obviously, in the day-to-day running, building, and maintaining of a network that you're going to be asked to answer. And that's the goal, is to have a platform that can help you quickly identify these problems. You can probably tell by looking at the gray hair here that I've been doing this for a number of years. I can remember when I started in networking, the network was a lot simpler. It was all sort of within your own control, maybe not the internet, but pretty much everything else was kind of within your own control. You built your own data centers, you had your own enterprise HQ, campus, branch office type network. Pretty much the network engineer had built it, configured it, maintained it. They might have some leased circuits from carriers or MPLS circuits, but for the most part, with the exception of those carrier circuits and the internet, everything was under your control, your purview, and you kind of had a pretty good idea what was going on with it, how it was configured, and so forth. Well, that's not the case anymore, right? We have applications that our dev teams have deployed that are in public cloud providers. We've got users who are consuming SaaS services out on the internet. A few examples here are Salesforce, Box, Workday, but I mean, the list goes on and on. We may either be delivering applications through a CDN, or we have users on the enterprise network that are consuming applications through a CDN. So connectivity to the internet and to those CDNs is critical for good user experience for our end users. So, the network has just kind of exploded and gotten more complex. But yet our applications still depend on the network, right? It's not really about the network, but having a well-performing network, we all know, significantly impacts user experience and application delivery. So that's the goal, is having a way to look after the network. I know for all of us who are network people, we'd love to believe it's never the network. It's always the application, but every once in a while it is the network, right? And the question is, if it is the network, how do I quickly get to root cause? How do I quickly figure out as fast as I can what the actual problem is with the network so that I can get it resolved, get the applications back up, get the users happy again, right?
Reboot the router.
That's always an option. Yes, reboot the router. Even if you don't know what the problem is, that's the answer. Network observability, again, we have this tagline. You'll see Kentik is the network observability company. We want to look after all networks, enterprise service provider, all areas of the enterprise, collect all telemetry, right? There's a lot of different types of telemetry. We'll talk about a few of them on the next slide that solve certain problems, but the reality is no one telemetry protocol, no one telemetry type answers all questions. So in order to really get to root cause, to really figure out what's going on in the network, you need multiple protocols, and you need them in the same platform so you can look in one place, but also so you can use one protocol to provide context to the other protocol, right? To be able to query that data and understand the context. And we'll talk a little bit more here in a minute about what I mean by that. Once you have all that data in one place, you want to be able to get insights into what's going on. In addition to being able to do reactive troubleshooting when you get a ticket, when there's a problem with an application, when your users are complaining, you also want to get proactive insights. You want to be notified, ideally, you want to be notified about a problem before your users notice it so that you can be on top of things and respond quickly before your users start complaining. And, kind of back to one of my earlier slides about the asking any question, right? The idea is to be able to query this large volume of data and get answers back quickly so that you can figure out what's going on with the network. As I mentioned earlier, we're a big flow company. That's kind of where we cut our teeth. That's where the company started and was founded, was to build a big scalable flow platform, right? NetFlow, SFlow, IPFix, doesn't really matter. We take in all the data sources, which we'll talk about in a minute, and normalize those. But we kind of started with flow, and it became obvious that that's the old way of doing things, is to just look at one telemetry protocol. While there's some really interesting things, I love flow. I think there's a lot of really great information that's buried in that protocol about what the traffic profile is. I like to tell the story when I was running a network. We first spun up, I think it was a MRTG server that looked at SNMP stats on all the interfaces. It was much better than logging into the devices and doing a show command and looking at the interfaces to see whether it was overutilized or not. It was great because you had a single, platform you could go in. I won't use single pane of glass. I almost did it, Steve. But you could log in, you could see all your interfaces, right? And you could see, like, when there was a DOS attack, you could see a traffic spike on one of your graphs. And you could pretty easily track it from the edge of the network all the way to the other edge of the network by looking at the graphs on the inbound and outbound interfaces. And you can kind of see, hey, I know where the traffic's coming in and I know where it's going out just based on the SNMP stats. It's like, hey, that's great. Now, what makes up that traffic? Oh, gee, I have no idea. Well, that's not really that helpful for actually stopping the DOS attack. You may now know you have one, but how the heck do you figure out, like, what the profile is? What are the ports that it's on, the attack is against? What are the IP addresses that it's against? And so I can remember when we first turned on our flow tool, and we were able to see source and destination ports and protocols and, like, what made up the DOS attack. It's like, holy cow, this is so much easier than trying to build that access list that logs everything, dig through the logs to figure out what the attack profile is, and then adjust your ACLs to block that attack. Once you had the flow and you could actually see what the attack makeup was, and you could actually block an attack much more quickly, right? Fast forward to today, being able to take SNMP and flow and potentially streaming telemetry and logs and all these other telemetry sources that we have in the network and combine them takes that even a step further and provides much more context about what that traffic profile is, what the makeup of that traffic is. Just sort of a kind of quick background on how Kentec works, right? So as I mentioned, we pride ourselves on being able to look after a lot of different types of networks. So in a service provider network, core and edge, in the enterprise, cloud networks, WAN networks, internet, containers, We'll talk a little bit more about each of these as we go throughout our talks today, but there's a lot of different disparate, I'll call them, networks that we're able to observe. The way we do that, our primary data sources are, like I said, the flow protocols, VPC flow logs from AWS and Google Cloud. Microsoft Azure wants to be different, so they call them NSG logs, but similar concept in that it's giving us a text-based representation of the traffic that's flowing in and out of that cloud environment. We take that data source in and just like we would flow protocols, give you some visualization of what's going on in your network. Taking in streaming telemetry, taking in SNMP, taking in data from host. My final talk today, we'll talk a little bit more about what we're doing on the host side, container side as well. Synthetic tests. So, passive, I'll call all these other protocols passive testing, right? Flow, SNMP. We're not actually putting traffic on the network to observe what's going on with it. We're using those protocols to observe and to track the actual traffic on the network. And I'm going to call that passive monitoring. On the other side, you have what we call active monitoring, where you're doing synthetic testing, right? You have usually an agent that's running somewhere that's actually doing a ping or a trace route or a curl or loading an application. It's putting traffic on the network to test how the performance of the network is. And the reason for that is because typically your flow protocols, they'll have great information about bits per second, packets per second, the volume of traffic, the traffic profile, the makeup of that traffic. But what they're lacking is what I think most network enterprise network engineers think of is performance is latency, loss, jitter, those type of things, not what's the volume of the traffic. It's interesting coming from somewhat of a service provider background. When I would talk to people about network performance, they're like, well, where's your packet loss measurement? I'm like, well, we don't get that in flow. They're like, well, what do you mean when you say network performance? I'm like, well, I have a 10 gig pipe. I only have 8 gig of traffic on it. It's performing great. That's the service provider way of looking at things. The pipe's not full and therefore network's performing great. And that's kind of what flow gives you. Whereas active monitoring, synthetic testing gives you the ability to take that a step further and look at things like latency, packet loss, jitter, those type of measurements as well.
Syslogs or no syslogs?
Syslogs, I'm going to be on a roadmap slide here in a minute, so we'll table that till the roadmap. I'll talk a little bit about that, but that is something that we're working on.
Could this be a good slide for you to clarify? We used to call this like monitoring systems, and now we're calling them observability. Is there a difference, or is that a name change? And if there is a difference, can you walk through what qualifies something to be called an observability platform as opposed
versus
to
monitoring or visibility? I would say for me personally, the way I think about that is being two things. Having all this information in one place, right? And being able to provide the context and additional enrichments of the data makes it more of an observability thing than just monitoring. The other thing is those words to me conjure up thoughts of being more proactive, right? Being able to get insights, get proactive alerts and notifications when things are changing in the environment is more of an observability platform versus a monitoring platform where you're reactively going in and looking at things. We can do both, but our goal is really to move more towards being able to be proactive and notify users when there's actually a problem before they know they have a problem.
just notify or actually do something?
So as you'll see here on the right side, we have APIs, and our outbound APIs allow us to do a lot of things. So yes, we can do notifications. In fact, I think maybe, is it my next slide? Yeah, next slide here. In fact, I'll just transition to the slide to answer your question, Steve. We integrate with a lot of different systems, whether that's ingest, because we know there are a lot of other systems that are in the tool belt of the modern network engineer, whether those are Datadog, Splunk, Sumo, Amazon S3. You can see a lot of the logos here on the slide. We can ingest those data, but also on the output side, on the destination side, being able to notify through ServiceNow or PagerDuty, be able to notify you when you're having a problem, syslog, email, generic JSON. We also have the ability to send the data off to another system, right? Be able to put it in Splunk, be able to put it in Datadog, Sumo Logic, wherever you need that data to live. And that could be because your application people want to see network context in the application, the APM tool that they're working out of, like a New Relic, for example. They want that network context. So that's an interesting use case. I think specific to your question, Steve, the JSON webhook allows us to integrate with automation tools. So, if you've got you want to automatically make changes to the network, config changes based on traffic changes that we alert in the product, being able to use that JSON webhook allows you to integrate with those third-party tools. And we have some customers who do some of that. We have some that are built in the product, and then we have, like I said, a generic JSON webhook that allows you to kind of customize it the way you need to be able to.
So would you say then that an observability solution would have all of those features then? The monitoring, the aggregation and analysis, the notification, and the ability to proactively do things, it would require all four of those to be called an observability?
Yeah, absolutely. Yep. And I think Phil's going to talk a little bit more about this in his section. He's going to a little better define observability and what we mean when we say that word, and some of the, the data enrichment.
We have to start defining that word because
Yeah,
everybody's throwing it out now, and that's
absolutely
why I'm pushing it.
Yep, I understand. Yep, and that's why I said, it's easy to get snarky and think, oh, that word doesn't actually mean anything. And I think,
well,
we can use whatever term we want to use.
To mean
right, exactly. I do too. Right, like let's define what we mean when we say that. Like, what is the approach we're taking? Right.
Yeah.
Roadmap. So if you've watched a Kentik presentation before, this is something we typically talk about, both the roadmap that we're focused on near term, and then my next slide we'll talk about things we're not currently focused on, because we believe it's important as a startup to focus on what you do well and not try and solve all things for all people. So near term, what we're currently working on, a full-on metrics platform. So as I mentioned, we've taken in S&P for a long time, but historically, traditionally, it was very focused on like the interface MIBs to figure out when we get in a flow record and it's got an IF index in it, what interface does that belong to? What's the interface name? What's the interface description? What's the speed on that interface? Some of those kind of things. So our S&P support was pretty lightweight because it was really just designed to enrich flow data and make more sense of that flow data. It was less designed to be a full-on metrics platform, but that's what we're focused on right now. We're building out a full metrics platform. In true Kentik style, we're building the ingest for that metrics platform to be very flexible. So we'll be able to do S&P where we go out and do a S&P get or an S&P walk and pull that data from that device into the Kentik platform. But we're also going to build it in a way that it can support streaming telemetry. So if you're using GNMI and you're using more of a push method to push your metrics into a platform, we can support that as well, right? Because at the end of the day, it's really more about the metrics. The delivery mechanism of whether we pull it off the device or it gets sent to us doesn't really matter, right? It's just more about getting those metrics, collecting them, being able to provide them in the same UI. You have all your flow data, and then we'll figure out from there what the really interesting context is that we can provide to that traffic. Events, I think this was to your question around syslog. It is something we're working on, is to be able to add events into it. I don't know that we're necessarily going to be a syslog platform in and of itself, but being able to have those events to correlate, for example, on a graph, if I have a spike in traffic or a drop in traffic, it'd be really interesting to know, at the same time that took place, there was also a commit that took place on my Juniper device, or there was an interface that went down right as that traffic dropped off. Those type of events that are taking place, which are probably wrapped up in some sort of syslog, would be really interesting to be able to correlate with this data. So that's something we're working on.
So do you think you're going to be a second destination for that, or are you going to generate queries to a robust syslog platform and see what's there?
I would think probably a second destination for the syslog. I haven't spent a lot of time with the product engineering team to see what their design looks like on this, whether they'd be able to pull it out of an existing syslog and query against an existing syslog system, or whether they'd expect to have it pushed. But I would say probably either one is, on the table.
So I deal with Kentik from time to time, working for different ASNs as we're mitigating attacks and looking at things. And one of the things that struck me when you were talking about the different sources is that if you look at the normal flow data, it's pretty common to see source IPs spoofed out of cloud these days. That's been happening for a long time. BCP 38 not being totally implemented. And as you're building all these different sources of data that are getting in there, if you're taking in VPC data from a current cloud, especially I worked in enterprise as well as service provider. I remember a lot of times when we would get DDoS attacks in enterprise, like, did I just DDoS myself? Did I just do something to knock myself down? Is that on the roadmap? Is that in the realm of possibility as you look at these data, as you say, hey, I'm taking in data from the VPC. I'm also taking in this data that says this attack is originating from AWS. It might not be. When I look at the Kentik dashboard, is that in the realm of possibility with all these sources?
Yeah, for sure. We have a pretty rich alerting engine already, a policy engine already that allows you to build. I think DDoS is sort of the easy one to think about and the easy use case to talk about because it's something that people have been using Flow to do for a long time. But Kevin, to your point, DDoS could also be you DDoSed yourself, right? You had an increase in traffic as a result of an application being deployed someplace you didn't expect, or a change in traffic patterns in the enterprise for something that was beyond your control. And our policy engine allows you to build those type of policies, right? And basically anything you can query and get a visualization against in the platform, you can also turn into a policy and say, I want this query of data pulled out of the database and I want to set a threshold on it. That could be a static threshold of like a certain amount of packets per second, flows per second, bits per second, or it could be a baseline. Or you can set a baseline. You say, all right, this is what normal should look like in my network. Alert me if there's a deviation against that baseline. So that's actually something you have to be a little bit creative in building your policy, but that's something you could actually do today with your VPC flow logs is to set a baseline of what that traffic looks like and get a proactive notification when there's a deviation from that baseline. Is that kind of answering where you're...
Meantime to innocence, I could put my AWS space that's in there and say, okay, this is not my AWS source. This is something else, or it is.
Yeah.
We just shot ourselves in the foot.
Yeah. And another interesting dimension, we haven't really talked about what dimensions are in Kintik, but think of it as like a column in the database, right, that we're enriching each one of the flows with. So one of the dimensions that we store in Kintik is the IP addresses that belong to the cloud providers. So even if you're not collecting your VPC flow logs, you're only collecting traffic on your traditional network infrastructure, let's say in your data center. If you have traffic going to AWS, we'll be able to provide you a dimension that says these IP addresses that this traffic is going to are actually AWS IP addresses. So you can see traffic leaving your data center and you can see what the profile of that traffic is going to those public cloud IP addresses. So that could be interesting for what you're after there, I think, Kevin.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. One last bullet point on this one, and then I'll move on in the interest of time here. GCP. So for a while, we've had some really cool visualizations, which Ted's going to talk about in his cloud section for AWS and Azure. That can show you your VPCs, that can show you your regions, your zones, how your network is actually built and designed in the public cloud. We've had traffic information in Google for quite a while, but you had to query it in our data explorer, in our query engine, and build your own dashboards, which is interesting. But the topology view, what we call the Kentik map, people really love that for the AWS and the Azure side. And this quarter, we're working on building that out on the Google side as well. So we'll be able to do similar visualizations in Google that we've been doing for a while in AWS and Azure. So it's something we're working on this quarter as well. If you've seen our co-founder and CEO, Avi Friedman, present before, this is one of his favorite slides. They talk about the negative roadmap. And like I said earlier, we want to have some focus as a startup, right? We want to focus on the things we can do well and sort of like, I'll say, work out from the core there, right? You'll see some things that are struck out on this negative roadmap because originally these were things we weren't focused on. But as we grew the product, as we listened to user feedback, as people said, hey, it'd be really great if you did X because it's pretty close to what you're already doing and it would really help me solve some problems that I'm trying to solve in my environment, we have started adding some of that functionality into the product. But as of today, sitting here at Network Field Day 31, these are things we're not currently on the roadmap, that our development team is not currently actively working on. I won't go through all of them, but I think the one that Tyler was asking about, wireless. There's clearly this is something that, and especially in a campus and branch location and enterprise, you're probably constantly having to bang your head against the wall with users having problems with the wireless networks. There is a lot of rich data for sure, telemetry data on those wireless. Could be interesting at some point, but it's not something that we're actively working on right now. Databases, storage, those are kind of things. Java instrumentation, sort of the app layer, code point instrumentation stuff. There are a lot of vendors out there that I think are doing a pretty good job of that. So that's not something we're currently working on adding into our product. Although, like I said in a previous slide, there's a lot of integrations. So you could definitely get creative with taking data from our system and putting them into those systems to provide some information to your application developers. Just not something we're actively working on adding into our platform today. So
Just say that it's really nice to see people or companies admit that they made a mistake there too. It's not often you see strikeout things. I changed my mind on a slide.
Yeah.
It's a good thing to see.
Yeah, I mean, again, we kind of pride ourselves on hearing from the customer base and even potential customers and saying, "Hey, I really need this. This would be really helpful. What you have, works really well, but these other data sources, these other use cases, if you could solve these other problems in my environment, that would provide even more value to me." And so, I'll say, to some degree, nothing's off the table, but we are trying to focus on the things we know are pretty close to what we're already doing, but provide a little more information, solve some problems for our customers. So.
Real quick question. How do you monitor or help the user experience for remote workers that aren't behind the corporate network? And as we go, more and more people are hitting the cloud services, SaaS and stuff like that without going through the corporate network. So how do you manage that?
Yeah, that's a great question. We like I said, we do have a synthetic platform that we've built that does some active testing. One of the things I would say wasn't on. I don't think it was on my. Yeah, it's not on the negative roadmap, but I guess maybe arguably should be. We're not planning on doing an endpoint agent at the moment. Being able to install an agent on a cell phone, on a laptop, on a tablet, that's a whole business unit in and of itself, right? So that's not something we're currently focused on. I would say right now for doing that, most of ours is going to be focused on being able to monitor performance of your internet connectivity back into your headquarters or wherever those users are connecting. Phil's going to talk a little bit about WAN and SD-WAN and some of the things we're doing there. There may be some potential answers to your question, Greg, and in Phil's section talking about the WAN and what we're monitoring there. But most of it's going to be focused on once those folks working remote connect into either your CASB or your SASE solution or ultimately back into your headquarters office, as opposed to monitoring their connectivity from their device to the wireless, for example, in their home. Not really something we're currently focused on.